Hinduism is admittedly a bit of an awkward term for the collection of faith traditions and practices, philosophical and metaphysical perspectives originating in ancient India, that hold reverence for the Vedas as a checkmark for inclusion. There is enough unity among them that Hinduism works as a term, but also enough diversity within those things that are signified by that term, that if someone cheekily says to you that Hinduisms is probably more accurate, they aren't entirely off the mark. Though it's a bit more of a mouthful, Hindu dharma traditions is perhaps more accurate still. It's going to take some time before the latter terminology becomes commonplace. So until then, we'll be using both Hinduism and Hindu dharma traditions interchangeably. Know that for understanding why Hindu dharma traditions, plural yet united in ways, is a more accurate term than Hinduism, singular and monolithic, this episode will make it clear. All of the world's religions have internal divisions, sometimes deep ones. Roman Catholic versus Protestant versus Orthodox in Christianity, sometimes ones that wars have been fought over and caused serious geopolitical tensions millennia after the division was first created. Sunni versus Shia in Islam, sometimes the divisions are more philosophical and theological and practical. Mahayana versus Theravada within Buddhism, Reconstructionist versus Reform versus Conservative versus Orthodox Judaism. And within many of these are further distinctions on points of theology, practice, and on where final authority to decide points of doctrine or belief resides. All of these can be called sects of a religion. In the broadest terms and generally speaking, the Hindu dharma traditions are not different. Though, as you'll soon find out, the details are distinct within Hinduism. I'm Matt McDermott, and this is All About Hinduism. The closest thing the Hindu dharma traditions have to the divisions I just mentioned within other religions are probably the different deity traditions. That is, which deity or set of deities becomes the focus of attention in the spiritual life of individuals. At least in the modern era, there is generally little genuine animosity between these traditions, though each is distinct enough that some practices and beliefs can be nearly contradictory. It's emblematic of modern Hindu practice that there is a live and let live approach between, say, those people who focus their attention on one deity and those who do so on another. I'm being a bit vague here intentionally, as the idea that there can be conflict, sometimes violent and sometimes even arising to the level of outright war between sects, has occurred in other religions historically, and even in recent historical memory. This isn't the case within the Hindu dharma traditions in contemporary times. Also, I want to emphasize that two things are at play at once here. Though each of these deity traditions is distinct enough that they could be seen as nearly separate religions, with distinct perspectives on the relation between humans and the divine, as well as rich, distinct cultural traditions, there are enough unifying factors between them to place them under the same umbrella, as it were. The lack of understanding of this structure by the non-Hindu public is part of the issue, I'm convinced, in people thinking that Hinduism is hard to understand or is contradictory. Sometimes it is contradictory, I'll grant you. Some traditions are strict vegetarian teetotalers, in others there is animal sacrifice, in others cannabis plays a prominent role in the spiritual practice of the renunciant monks and the lay public on certain holidays, to cite just some examples that come up among outside observers. But it's not ultimately hard to understand. What you have to do is take each tradition on its own terms and recognize that they are all perspectives on the same reality, different routes going up one face of the same spiritual mountain. And if each of these traditions is a different path going up the same general area of the same spiritual mountain, there are also different guides for each of the paths, pointing out different highlights of the route and recommending different techniques for ascent. That's about as far as I can stretch the hiking metaphor here, but basically each of these guides forms a different lineage within a deity tradition, and there are also different lineages of teachers within these, so subdivisions within subdivisions within subdivisions. It would take an entire show or 5 to detail all of the divisions and their histories and subtleties, and as interesting as delving into those can be, to get a good basic grasp of Hinduism, you don't really need to know them all. Knowing the different deity traditions, however, will give you a good grounding. With one important thing to note. This applies to the Hindu dharma traditions of India and within the Indian Hindu diaspora, and with those people who have embraced Hindu dharma, but who are ethnically from outside the Indian or South Asian community. Balinese Hindu tradition, remember the Indonesian island of Bali is one of the few places in the world outside of the Indian subcontinent that is majority Hindu. Bali is organized differently, which is a topic for another episode and another day. So, the deity traditions of Hinduism. Shaivism, the tradition of devotion to Lord Shiva. Even here, a collection of traditions, as there are 6 major modern subdivisions within the Shaivite tradition, is arguably the oldest of the extant Hindu dharma traditions. Seals from the Indus-Sarasvati civilization show a form of Shiva seated in meditation and date back at least 4,000 years, with some adherents saying the tradition goes back even farther. Those people who make Lord Shiva the focus of devotion in spiritual practice are known as Shaivites. The adjective form is sometimes Shaiva, Shaiva Dharma, Shaiva philosophy. Here, emphasis is on the veneration of Shiva, forms of whom encompass all the cosmic/metaphysical functions of creation, preservation, and destruction. Shiva is considered masculine, though it's important to remember that masculine here, despite graphical representations, is usually thought of as an embodiment of energy that gets labeled masculine, rather than being male in a biological sense. Veneration of Shiva's feminine energied counterparts also plays a role. Veneration of embodiments of Shakti. Lord Shiva's metaphysical sons, Ganesh and Kartikeya/Murugan, also figure prominently, though the latter divinity plays a larger part in South India and in Sri Lanka than it does in northern areas. Both Ganesh and Murugan have historically and today had their own deity traditions, people who make Ganesh or Murugan their primary focus of their spiritual practice. For the sake of this podcast, though, we'll leave those aside. Asceticism plays a strong role in many of the Shaivite traditions, and most are non-dual in their outlook. That is, spiritually speaking, at the deepest level, there's no ultimate separation between incarnate beings and the world we see around us, and the ultimate reality. Vaishnavism. Vaishnavism, the adherents of which are generally known as Vaishnavas, sometimes Vaishnavites, is the collection of spiritual traditions where Vishnu, or often one of his 10 incarnations such as Krishna or Ram, as well as their feminine counterparts, is the focus. It also dates back several thousand years, at least to a couple hundred years BCE. Today's main Vaishnav schools of thought date back to the Middle Ages, and were founded by historically documented individuals, Ramanuja, Madhva, Nimbarka, Vallabha, and Chaitanya. Each of these has a differently nuanced take on the relationship between humans, really all of manifest existence, and the ultimate reality, though risking simplifying highly complex, debated, and articulated philosophies, a spiritual duality exists in the world. Meaning, though there is an underlying spiritual unity of existence, the ultimate reality and individual beings are distinct. The distinctions between dualism, known as Dvaita in Sanskrit, and non-dualism, Advaita, deserve their own episode, not to mention that Advaita philosophy in recent decades has evolved into its own Hindu-inspired, non-theistic philosophical tradition, sometimes called Neo-Advaita as well. But for now, let's leave it there. Shakta, Shaktism. Those Hindus who make veneration of the Divine Mother, divinity represented in a feminine form, the focus are known as Shaktas. The traditions are known as Shakta or Shaktism. These sects originated, in ways that resemble today's practices, some 1,500 years ago. The specific form of feminine divinity is emphasized, varies regionally. For example, devotion to Kali as the Divine Mother is particularly popular in Bengal and northeastern India. Shakta practices, too, are diverse, ranging from conventional, devotional, and temple-focused to more shamanic to highly esoteric ones that deliberately transgress social norms to realize the unity of all existence. Sidebar, the last of those is also present within some Shaivite ascetic traditions. Like Shaivism, Shakta philosophy is generally non-dual in outlook, emphasizing the embrace of imposing but complementary forces in the universe. Feminine versus masculine energetic embodiments of the divine, for instance. Smartism. The Smarta branch of the Hindu Dharma traditions, which today encompasses sects dedicated to the veneration of Ganesh and Surya, is, in the words of the monks of the Quayadanan, synonymous with the teachings of Adi Shankara, a historical monk and philosopher who, quote, campaigned India-wide to consolidate the faiths of his time under the banner of Advaita Vedanta. Smartas direct their devotion towards one of 5 forms of the divine, Ganesh, Surya, Vishnu, Shiva, or Shakti. Whichever one is focused on is known as the individual's Ishta Devata, preferred deity. The same term is also used more broadly within Hinduism, but within Smartism, it's referring to one of these deities specifically. For Smartas, as is the case with most Hindus, each of these forms of the divine is considered a reflection, a form of one divine source, Saguna Brahman. As Adi Shankara proclaimed, quote, "It is the one reality which appears to our ignorance as a manifold universe of names and forms and changes." I'll read that again, well, a paraphrase of it, because I think it is a thread that holds together much of Hindu thought, both today and historically. There is one reality which appears as a universe of many names and forms. It is through ignorance that we fail to understand and realize this. This ignorance can be overcome through individual effort, study, and striving, the methods of which, too, can take many forms and names. Kamaram. This deity tradition is often left out, and compared to the others is much more regional in nature, in South India and Sri Lanka, but definitely deserves mention. Kamaram is the set of spiritual traditions that venerate Murugan, who also goes by the name of Kartikeya, as well as others. As Murugan is also a strong part of some Shaivite traditions, there's some overlap, but in the Tamil diaspora, focusing devotional activity uniquely on Murugan rises to the level of being its own deity tradition. Before we wrap up this episode, it's important to recognize that over the centuries, entire deity traditions have in effect gone extinct. Here's Vijay Satnarayan on Saura Dharma.
Saura tradition or Saura Dharma is one of the Dharma traditions that we consider as extinct. What do we mean by extinct? Well, of course, people venerate the sun in Hindu traditions, or I would rather correct myself and say the solar divinity. Different traditions, different ancestral traditions, different tribal traditions across ancient India venerated the sun simply because everybody knew intuitively that the sun is the source of life on earth. The sun is the source of our ability to eat and our ability to progress as civilizations. So they venerated the sun in their own ways. But the sun temples, therefore, were some of the most beautiful, some of the most abiding types of temples that we've had in South Asia, and of course were the first targets of conquering foreign entities. One of the first was the Sun Temple in what is now Multan. And when, people came and raided, they were surprised to see just how far flung different types of people, they said even people from China and beyond, were coming to venerate the solar divinity at this temple. When they realized how powerful it was the first tradition from the Hindu set of civilizations that they encountered, and they set about destroying it. But they destroyed it first by demeaning it. And that kind of demeaning bent is what characterizes how they approached all of the sun temples they found. But what were they able to do, and why am I mentioning the sun temples, is because the sun temples were the location of the traditions, the teachers and the students, the sources of their philosophy were all gathered around these areas. And the first sets of people to be murdered would be those teachers in those areas. So the ability of the Saura set of traditions to pass on knowledge and practices from one generation to the others, they were cut out completely. And this is what we mean when we call a Dharma tradition extinct. There are no more living traditions that connect the early practices with today. However, Surya still is venerated in most of the traditions in the Hindu world, and indeed in the Buddhist and Jain world. Surya, and specifically Saura Dharma practices, survived in certain regions in different ways. For example, in Bihar, Chhat Puja is done in a way that does not align with any type of Sanatana philosophy, but it is done in a way that is completely in line with Saura practices, Saura Dharma practices. So the practices survive, and some of the stories and philosophies also survive as they were adopted into, say, Smarta Dharma, which is this kind of Unitarian thing where the Supreme Being can be one of those, whether you come from a Shaiva background or a Shakta background, you could think of Ishvara as Shiva or Shakti or Vasudeva or Ganesha or Kartikeya or Surya. So Smartas became a vehicle for Sauras to survive, at least in their philosophies, not in their original way, but in a way that allowed some of it to be available to us today. So those are the two methods in which Saura Dharma survives. but as its own individual set of spiritual traditions, that unfortunately has been cut off. So that's why we are talking about Saura Dharma, similarly Ganapatya Dharma, as extinct Dharma traditions plus thousands of Vedic shakas.
You've made it to the end of this episode of All About Hinduism. Before you go, do me a favor. Leave us a nice 5-star review on whatever platform you're listening to this on. Please also subscribe or follow us so you can get all the new episodes the moment they're released. And if you found this episode informative, enjoyable, and useful, please share it right now with someone who will feel the same about it. Finally, you can help ensure that more of these get made by making a donation to HAF at hinduamerican.org/donate. Thanks for listening.